In 1997, archaeologists working out in the arid Tepe Mountains, some 60 kilometers to the east of Sanliurfa, came upon something they hadn't expected. Out there, in the harsh open hills of Turkey's southeastern provinces, where the height of summer seems like a scorched alien world, innumerable incredible archaeological sites had already been added to an ever-growing list since digs began in the 1960s. And yet more would follow. For even in those dry, arid hills, there is life. By the late autumn, as the harsh summer sun releases its grip on the land, and winter grasses sprout, animals begin moving in en masse. Nomadic clans heading down from the slopes of Mount Karakadog to the north, to graze their herds on the pastures of the Tepe hillsides. Dwarfed by that true mountain to the north, the Tepes are hills in reality, formed by erosion during relatively recent interglacial and post-glacial periods of the last ice age, when this was a humid, abundant land, populated by colossal herds of wildlife. A not too distant time of 10,000 and more years ago, still visible on the landscape in long dried up riverbeds and abundant fossil remains. Though little remains now from that post-glacial epoch of plenty, the Tepes remain a popular place for hunting, though much of the game is now officially protected as endangered species by the Turkish government. Today, the majority of people make their living not from wild food, but the descendants of the hunted and the gathered. Harnessed and selectively bred many thousands of years ago through the arts of animal husbandry and agriculture. Just how long those nomadic travellers have made that journey down to the Tepe hills for the winter is difficult to say. Nor just how often goats and sheep have grazed the slopes of one hill in particular. But this is where Turkish archaeologist Bahattin Çelik and his colleagues made their astounding realizations in 1997. In those days, it had no name. But today, it's famous, named for a nearby hill, known worldwide as Karahan Tepe. By that time, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe just a few years earlier on a relatively nearby hilltop had already completely altered our understanding of that distant epoch after the end of the last ice age. And now, one by one, similar sites were being located. But of all those sites, it was Karahan Tepe that made the biggest mark of all. Here, sprawling over that sun-baked hilltop, even prior to digging, Çelik and his team counted hundreds of T-shaped megalithic obelisks, like those found at Göbekli Tepe. bizarre monoliths jutting out of the ground, near everywhere they looked. After preliminary digs, well over 250 would be located in all. Oozing for some 33 hectares across the entirety of the hilltop and adjacent slopes. Besides the steep rocky edges on the southern and western sides, every part of the hill was coated with the edifices of humanity. And when full-scale digs began, the totem pole-like carvings of hybrid monsters, animals and people only added to the enigma of the site. It didn't take long for Karahan Tepe to be dated to the same age as Göbekli Tepe, and the earlier stages of the pre-pottery Neolithic settlement of Navali Chori, which would ultimately become a farming community. But there were differences too. Faced with nightmarish depictions of mythic hybrid forms and unfathomably complex iconography and art, of a completely different nature to any other site yet found in the region, Celik and his team knew it would take decades to get close to even a small picture of just what had happened there, all those millennia ago. Only then, in the 1990s, having the knowledge to realise what those jutting pillars were. How many countless other travellers had come to the place over the long millennia, not realising its man-made nature, we can only ponder. Today, going on 30 years has passed since the initial discovery of Karahan Tepe. A good deal of the site has been dug, revealing an incredibly complex series of megalithic enclosures. And yet still, only around 5% of the overall site has been exposed. Very little research published. Astonishingly, of the more than 40 similar sites from that same age, often referred to now as the Tash Tepele or Stone Hills culture. Though Gobekli Tepe was discovered earlier, Karahan Tepe could be even bigger and of a greater age. If you haven't seen it already, here is my film on Göbekli Tepe. It's nearly 3 hours long, and it took me years to research. Soon, we'll embark on our journey to decipher some of the secrets of Karahan Tepe, potentially coming to some conclusions about this incredible and mysterious site. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. My name's Pete Kelly. I'm a writer from the UK and the guy behind this channel. As a historian, I'm fascinated by family history. I think remembering those who came before isn't just important, but fundamental to understanding who we are today. My Heritage, the sponsor of today's video, is a great way to get to grips with who your ancestors were and where you came from. To get started, all I had to do was input the names of my parents, and the automated tools within My Heritage allowed me to build my own family tree. Using the Instant Discoveries feature, I've been able to create a detailed network of my family, going back nearly 200 years, by connecting to other family trees from existing users of MyHeritage. I was even able to find my great-great-grandfather William Duffy, who was born all the way back in 1840 in Omagh, where I still have family today. On the other side of the family, this newspaper article I found using Record Match shed light on my great-grandfather, P. Vaughan Bevan, who was born in Melbourne, Australia, and was quite the amateur athlete, described as having the family faculty for hurdling. Maybe I'll have to give it a go. Another feature on MyHeritage is the photo editing tool. This is an old picture from 100 years ago of my great-grandfather Dan Duffy. Not only could I restore the image, but colorise it and animate it too, really making him come alive. If you're a fan of history like me, I just know you'll love these features MyHeritage has to offer. Sign up now using the link in the description to find out the amazing stories your ancestors have to tell. Now, back to the ancient world. Approaching Karahan Tepe today. Dust clouds swirling over the empty mountain road. It's not difficult to see why it took so long to be rediscovered by the modern world. Though every hilltop threatens now to reveal remains from the prehistoric past, until comparatively recently, the sheer isolation and size of the place kept its secrets hidden. Even when approaching the site itself on foot, there isn't much to see from below. Not just no temples, but no great roofed structure to protect the site, or permanent visitor centre like at Göbekli Tepe. Systematic digs only having begun in 2019. Just a few minutes later though, when ascending the low slope of the hillside, all of a sudden, amazing things are to be seen. The relatively small number of trenches that have been dug so far being more than enough to showcase the sheer scale and complexity of the overall site. Thought to sprawl far and wide across the entire hilltop. A place of innumerable mysteries. Even now, after close to 30 years of investigation, a great deal of systematic planning and surface surveys having been carried out before the full-scale digs began, still not one shard of pottery has ever been found, nor any evidence of domesticated plants or animals. Like Gobekli Tepe and countless other sites across the region, the evidence overwhelmingly suggesting people here to have lived a complex hunter-gatherer lifestyle. On the road to agriculture and animal husbandry for sure, but not there yet. A lifestyle reflected in the symbolism seen all over. In animal sculptures, T-shaped pillars, obelisks, and enclosures. This was not the farming world of the so-called Mother Goddess, seen in art by the time of the Neolithic, but seemingly a male-dominated one, phallic totems very often being depicted, both on animals and people. For example, just in 2023, a masculine statue was discovered of a man with ribs showing and prominent penis on display. His somewhat emaciated features looking the exact opposite of the mother goddess of Çatalhöyük, found in later farming societies. This particular tendency to prominently depict phalluses is perhaps most obviously seen in one of the enclosures that catches attention on the approach up the hill. One of the most unusual at any of the Taş Tepe sites. Enclosure AB is a relatively small chamber dug out of the hillside, with what look like pillars filling the space. An ominous head overlooking it all. Though official publications are few and far between, archaeologists have thus far speculated on the pillars representing penises. The place, overall, seeming to have something to do with fertility. There are many interlinked enclosures at Karahan Tepe, made with many different construction methods. Some carved directly into the bedrock, others combined with external masonry. Some of the most extensively excavated thus far, those linked to enclosure AB, the so-called penis room, are just as interesting. Enclosure AA on one side, having a deep pit within, with benches arrayed around the perimeter, seemingly to allow spectators to watch whatever took place here all those millennia ago. On the other side, enclosure AD is one of the largest, somewhat resembling the major structures at Göbekli Tepe, though entirely unique nonetheless. Surrounded by large pillars, this seems to have been the main chamber, attached to two smaller rooms. Just maybe, public and private spaces. One T-shaped pillar in particular in enclosure AD has received a lot of discussion, having the same anthropomorphic depiction of human arms on either side as at Göbekli Tepe. The hands also having 4 fingers each. A kind of rock-cut channel running between all 3 enclosures completes the picture. Perhaps used for the moving of sacred or ceremonial water between the chambers, for some unknown purpose or ritual. In truth, even to call the collections of megaliths at Karahan Tepe enclosures or chambers is to unwittingly do them a disservice. Though few other options exist in our much reduced frame of reference. Named alphabetically today, as archaeological convention dictates. Their original titles, names, meanings, are lost. It may even be that rather than temples under the star-studded sky, at least some of the structures here held roofs. A suggestion that had been made for Göbekli Tepe too. Remaining largely hypothetical until the discovery of a scattering of large stones all over the base of enclosure AC. Perhaps the remains of a roof. Some of the large pillars also seeming to hold grooves where other stones could have been slotted in on top. It might be then that some enclosures were roofed, others, perhaps much larger ones, were not. After all, given the wild variations of artistic depictions found at the site, there's no reason to assume any kind of standardization in construction methods. If some of the structures were roofed, however, as well as the significant amounts of so-called domestic evidence on the site, such as stone cookingware, it may be that at least some individuals lived here permanently. All year round. Even if a larger majority only visited seasonally, dating to some 12,000 years ago, with some experts suggesting an even older date. Karahan Tepe might nevertheless be considered one of the oldest permanent human settlements yet found on the planet. Construction at Karahan Tepe didn't happen all at once, but gradually over the course of many generations. Though over time, nearly the entire hilltop would be coated in enclosures and structures. Many not constructed externally, like at Göbekli Tepe, but cut deep into the rock itself. When viewing the entire mound from the air, the digs undertaken so far cover just a tiny fraction, some 5%, with the eroded tops of T-shaped pillars jutting out everywhere else. More and more monumental buildings are being uncovered all the time, always holding the potential to throw out everything we think we know thus far. One particularly interesting development is that people may have been buried at Karahan Tepe. Human remains always being something that was exceptionally rare at Göbekli Tepe. Though lead archaeologist there, Klaus Schmidt, nonetheless always thought burials would be discovered one day. In his view, these sites, at least in part, being monuments to the ancestors. Unfortunately, because of the early stage in investigations, as well as the difficulties that came with the global pandemic in 2020, little research has officially been published. it could still be years before any definitive conclusions are made by the on-site archaeologists. But this doesn't stop the rest of the archaeological community to delve into what is currently known. One of the best ways to do this is through the abundant material evidence, much of which is showcased now in the Sanliurfa Museum. Besides the stone bowls and instruments scattered around the site, are intricately carved idols found in dizzying amounts. Huge, ominous heads, totem pole-like pillars, and depictions of animals, often of a fearsome aspect. Boars, crocodiles, wolves, and bears being favoured. Another incredible realisation in the last few years is that at least some of the idols seem to have been painted. Unlike other totemic monuments throughout history, like at Cauvin in the Peruvian Andes, a similarly important foundational site, the totem poles at Karahan Tepe don't seem to reflect mythological creatures for the most part, but real-world animals, abundant in this region until relatively recently. And people entwined. One particularly striking figure that shows up several times is of a half-man, half-beast hybrid. Though erosion over the 11,000 years or so since it was first carved has somewhat reduced the definition of its form, an argument can be made for this particular statue to partially represent the apex predator which once flourished in this region, until going extinct in the 20th century. The leopard. Just like apex predators from all over the world, likely revered as a powerful rival to humanity. With a similar so-called cult of the leopard being carried on to Çatalhöyük in later millennia. But why would a leopard be depicted bursting out from a human form? Or vice versa? Man and animal entwined at the beginning of all things. "15,000 years ago, an extraordinary culture was flourishing across much of Eurasia. A great burst of creativity that can still be seen in the spectacular engravings and paintings that adorn rock surfaces from the French Périgord to the Russian plain. First revealed to the modern world in the late 1800s at world-famous sites like Altamira and Lascaux. Those magnificent pieces of art would completely change perceptions of what had been possible in the prehistoric world. Then, just over 100 years ago, after an interval of so many untold millennia, another of the masterpieces of that world came once again into the orbit of humanity. The year was 1912, when 3 teenagers in the far south of France, unknowingly teetering on the brink of the greatest single incident of suffering it had ever yet seen, stumbled upon an intricate prehistoric cave system known as Le Trois Frères. Within that cavernous network of winding paths and open spaces, apparently hidden for thousands upon thousands of years, a vast chamber stretched, broken up by stalactites and curving walls. And on those walls, just like at the previously discovered sites like Lascaux and Altamira, a variety of animal depictions could be seen. Bison, deer, owls, and lions. Just like at the Tas Tepe in southeastern Turkey, flourishing at the same time to the south and east, representations of animals seen in the landscape around. Very much within the same art tradition that existed in the Upper Paleolithic from as early as 40,000 years ago, all the way to the dawn of agriculture. But there is something else too that bears a similarity to those sites of the Tas Tepe, because alongside hunting scenes, just like at Karahan Tepe, there are phalluses too, given pride of place and prominence. But at Le Trois Frères, a particularly unique and then unprecedented painting was to be found. Around 14,000 years ago, deep in those subterranean passages, by the flicker of torchlight, a half-man, half-animal figure was painted. Just before work at the cave stopped, until after the war, due to the German invasion, this drawing was made, and the figure named the Sorcerer of Le Trois Frères. Painted all black. For some, the sorcerer has a bison head and human legs. Others describe it as a devil goat man. Though unique in paint, the sorcerer is far from a solitary find. Similar so-called little devils of the Paleolithic Magdalenian culture being seen at La Clara in Asturias and Abri-Messe in the Dordogne. When considered alongside the antler bone headdresses similarly being found at Star Car in Yorkshire from a more or less similar time period, further adding to the pool of evidence, the implications are staggering. Seeming to suggest liminal places in cave systems or bodies of water, where hybrid Ice Age beings were acted out or depicted, perhaps in a mimetic state of synthesis, where the person remained but became the animal too, where eater and eaten are one. The human and the natural world come together at the dawn of everything. And there is much more evidence too. By the time of the next war in 1939, another incredible find was made, truly demonstrating the deep antiquity of the human-animal hybrid tradition. Today, the Lion Man of Hohenstein Stadel remains one of the earliest and most remarkable of all displays of the creative spark ever seen in humanity. With a likely age of at least 30,000 years old, other estimates bringing it significantly older to near 40,000. Made of mammoth tusk, the most readily available material for those ancient Ice Age hunters. Though heavily eroded now, the piece has been suggested to depict a dancing figure, a bear or a lion, but with human-like features, perhaps engaged in some distant ritual. For archaeologist Stephen Mithen, having began its transition many thousands of years before, the Lion Man represents the point where the cognitive ability of humanity had definitively changed, culminating now in wild expressions of creativity that defy nature to survive across eons. For the first time ever in the entire universe, as far as we know, culture, intellect spilling forth from biology. Heading southwards across the sea, and further forwards in time, to the lush grasslands that once coated the Sahara Desert. Similarly fascinating carvings are to be seen. At the sites of Latmos and Jubba, parched rocky outcrops in the midst of mighty sand dunes and dead rivers, still stand the so-called dog heads of Fezzan. Though difficult to date, they are thought to have been created at roughly a similar time to the sprawling Neolithic town at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, in around 7 or 8,000 BC, where humans had begun intensively harnessing agriculture, though still engaged in hunting activities for much of their sustenance. There, where art and hunting scenes are seen on the walls of labyrinthine chambered homes, depictions of crane wings being worn by human actors can also be seen. And just like the Lion Man, one has been identified as a human-bear hybrid. The images perhaps depicting costumes worn by individuals engaged in ritual performances. But what does it all mean? As is often the case given the tiny fragments of evidence that survive, archaeologists are torn on the matter. But some, like South African David Lewis Williams, choose to see the myriad depictions of human-animal hybrids as having their roots in shamanistic ceremonies. Not too dissimilar to those still taking place all over the world today, involving altered states of consciousness. Perhaps it is no surprise that all of these depictions of hybrid animals, including those at Karahan Tepe, can be said to look psychedelic. At another ancient site, Shanidar IV, in what is now Kurdistan, an individual was found with substances buried alongside him that were found to be psychotropic, leading researchers to regard him as a shaman. With the most ancient of heritages, stemming from our deep hunter-gatherer past at the beginning of all things, shamanism is a concept seen all over the world, in all different cultures, at all different times. From the Siberian hermits who gave the term its modern name, to the natives of the deep Brazilian rainforests and aboriginals of Australia, there seems to be something in the concept that is exceptionally difficult to separate from humanity. Surviving in complex farming societies as well as in ancient tribes. Olmec were-jaguars of ancient Mesoamerica are a good example. Thought to have shapeshifted into different forms to travel to the other world on behalf of those gathered around. Bystanders perhaps joining in with the trance to aid the shaman in contacting ancestral spirits. At Karahan Tepe, the suggestion has been made that the monstrous hybrid figures could be half man, half leopard. Powerful hunters still found in the region until very recently. The enclosures perhaps acting like the cave in Paleolithic Europe or the temple of ancient Mexico. Mountaintops have often been seen as entranceways to the otherworld. Up in the clouds, where the veil between worlds is thinner than at ground level. Strange cutouts in the rock at both Göbekli and Karahan Tepe that could be construed as offering cups are found, as well as shreds of evidence for musical instruments, and yet more that could remain unrecognised within the growing museum collections of Anatolia. Bull roarers, rattles, scrapers, clappers and skin drums, being among the most ancient of instruments to have survived. Sounds that evoke distant memories of ancestral dancing around the T-shaped pillars. Just maybe in support of a shamanic journey. At all the sites of the Tash Tepeler, abundant displays of art and symbolism are to be seen. Displays that are impossible to explain without recognising the clearly advanced social organisation and rich culture required to create them. Symbolism that famously led Göbekli Tepe's first excavator, Klaus Schmidt, to suggest his site to be one of the first temples on Earth. And yet, today, given the evidence from all over the Paleolithic world, Karahan Tepe does not seem a place of firsts, but a continuation and development of existing hunter-gatherer lifeways. A great flourishing of societal complexity for sure, but set within the remit of wider humanity. And, amazingly, given our knowledge of the wider human story, it may be possible to interpret some of those tales written in the rocks so long ago. At Göbekli Tepe in particular, one T-shaped pillar holds a unique scene that anthropologists have pored over for decades in attempts to reconstruct early Holocene belief systems. The story it tells could well have happened at Karahan Tepe too, relating directly to the half-human hybrids so ornately carved there into the stone. For over 100 years now, largely using the still surviving shamanic traditions of hunter-gatherer groups on the fringe of the urban globalized world, anthropologists have sought to recreate the ideas of the very earliest era of humanity. In recent decades, it is to Pillar 43 in Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe that many have turned. Amazingly, its carvings potentially telling a similar story to the groups that still exist today. The tale of the shamanic journey. If this reading of the evidence is even partly correct, for a shaman or religious elder at Karahan Tepe all those millennia ago, just the same as a Siberian today, the situation would have likely been similar. A particularly prominent and confident individual, it was the shaman's job to act as a bridge for the community across the fluid borderlands to the world of the divine. Places considered particularly useful for this, traditionally being regarded as rivers and the summits of mountain peaks. In times of trouble, necessity or strife, the shaman would physically embark on a journey to the other side, with the aim of contacting the ancestral spirits to ask for their influence in the land of the living. In order to embark on his quest on the behalf of his community, not only would the shaman likely assume a costume, but often imitate a particular animal too. Shamanic alter egos worldwide, ranging from owls, deer, cranes, to jaguars, tigers, and leopards. Another tool in the shaman's kit often being psychoactive drugs. Death is often imitated, a symbolic end, and sometimes regeneration as the animal. Perhaps to not only get him or herself ready, but as a group activity for all to join in with the trance. Usually supported by music, incense, and chanting. Crucially, the shaman would not be alone on his voyage. In addition to the community members supporting him from Earth, friendly spirits like lizards, spiders, scorpions, foxes, frogs, and hares can lend a hand too. In many societies, the more of these they are known to be able to cooperate with, the more powerful they are assumed to be. Many of these supporting animals are seen at the Tash Tepe sites, with birds and snakes being particularly prominent, as well as scorpions, perhaps being a local variant of the worldwide phenomenon. The carvings in particular the one seen on Pillar 43, perhaps being further aids to help with the theatre of events. At Göbekli Tepe, one particular shaman or shamanic tradition may have utilised the fox as their spirit vessel. At Karahan Tepe, it may have been the leopard that was favoured. One of the stranger elements of the Tash Tepe sites, like Karahan Tepe, has been a complete failure to integrate them into existing models of the origins of stratified states. Previously assumed to have originated with agriculture. The seemingly institutionalised religious authorities, dogmas even, seen at the likes of Karahan Tepe, in the form of monumental building projects and activities long before the adoption of farming, being such a paradigm shifter that in the late 1990s it led French archaeologist Jacques Cauvin to argue religion to be in fact the prime mover to urban society. While Klaus Schmidt accepted the idea of shamanic rituals at the Tash Tepe sites, British archaeologist Ian Hodder took it even further by arguing for specific individual elders or trickster figures, specialising in ritual knowledge and presiding over construction efforts. It was at Hodder's site of Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia that some of the supposed earliest evidence of temples or shrines were uncovered in the 1960s by James Mellard. Following in the footsteps of Kathleen Kenyon at Jericho in classifying several structures as non-domestic ritual buildings. Very much in turn following the post-Enlightenment assumption first proposed by Emil Durkheim of a dichotomy between the sacred and the profane, or religious and everyday being at the centre of all religious beliefs. When Hodder reinvestigated Çatalhöyük in the 90s and 2000s, it was largely his job to quash these Eurocentric ideas. He found no distinction at all between the everyday and the spiritual, religion being suffused into everything at the site, the whole world given spiritual meaning. At Çatalhöyük, in their own way, every house was sacred. Perhaps the same went for Karahan Tepe too, where it would be outdated today to say the megaliths formed temples or shrines alone, the terms seeming somewhat redundant given the sheer amount of activities likely carried out there. Just maybe, above all, the theatrical displays of shamanic elders, willing builders of the enclosures around them, dancing at the dawn. The more we learn about Karahan Tepe, the more amazing it becomes. Complex hunter-gatherers, still closely tied to their traditions of old, but adhering to new ways now too, coming together to create something incredible, transcending them all. But what of those individuals who planned and orchestrated the construction efforts? For though many archaeologists have argued for the birth of a priesthood of sorts here, loyalty could surely not be guaranteed to any single individual. the first verifiably hereditary priesthoods only arriving thousands of years later. After all, each enclosure may well have been buried after its immediate use, perhaps suggesting rival traditions. And there are other hints at the Tash Tepe sites that unity may not have been the only way of life. At Chianu, another of the Tash Tepe sites, the remains of over 450 people, including headless torsos, have been found. In a room christened the House of Skulls. Vertebrae attached to some of the skulls suggested they were axed while flesh still remained on the body. When beheaded, most seemed to be in the prime of life. Though not necessarily killed by the beheadings, archaeologist Robert Braidwood did not shy away from the possibility. Traces of blood still staining the stone structure adjacent to a public plaza that looks suspiciously like a sacrificial altar. Another facet of human society, seen in cultures all over the world, is that when populations increase above around 100 or 150 individuals, so too do mistrusts and anxieties. A niggling worry of some unseen future, or a so-called other. Such esoteric anxieties as these are hard for even an all-knowing shaman to deal with. Let alone people today, leading to fights, skirmishes, and full-scale war. One way of attempting to deal with these pressures of living as a large group is also seen all over the world at the beginnings of almost every society on Earth. The very real possibility exists that human sacrifice was practiced at the so-called House of the Skulls at Chianu. We don't know for sure, but scraps of skulls found at Göbekli Tepe too may represent some kind of a similar situation, and perhaps at Karahan Tepe too. It has been argued that as soon as human society becomes stratified and complex, human sacrifice appears. Here we have another interpretation of the Goat Man. The scapegoat or sacrificial lamb of later generations. And our world today, just possibly having its roots here. Ancient sacrifices orchestrated by shadowy cabals of cunning proto-priests. Before the discovery of Karahan Tepe, its sister site, Göbekli Tepe, was seen by many as something of an enigma. An anomaly. But in reality, though astonishing in its complexity, this was far from the case for those well versed in the pre-pottery Neolithic world. archaeologists, already having worked in the region for 3 decades by that point, uncovering sites of a similar age and culture at the likes of Navali Chori. Notably where T-shaped pillars also once stood. And Chianu, where American Robert Braidwood tirelessly dedicated his career. Today, out on the so-called hilly flanks between the Zagros and the Taurus Mountains, named as such by Braidwood in relation to their supposed peripheral location to the more popularly known Fertile Crescent. More than 40 contemporary sites with T-shaped pillars or similar figurative decorations have been located. Far from anomalies, the fabulously complex architecture at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe fitting in easily with the ever-changing archaeological consensus. Seashells found at Karahan Tepe from the far-off Mediterranean and Red Seas, along with obsidian shards from central Anatolia, hint at the long-distance transportation of goods and people. Many archaeologists seeing widespread population movements as common in prehistory, with others even arguing for proto-trade networks having developed by this time. Given the sheer scale of their construction and their possible seasonal nature, the possibility exists then that the megalithic monuments of the Tash Tepe were not merely local investments, but regional affairs, with some individuals travelling considerable distances to take part. Clearly, these were time and labour intensive events. Construction efforts that could only have been undertaken by a cohesive, cooperative and well-resourced population. Many archaeologists have argued that the ritual investments at Karahan Tepe could have been either knowingly or unknowingly undertaken by individuals as a sign of commitment to their community. Allowing reputations to be built and maintained, and even outsiders to the initial community to be impressed. Though there is currently no evidence of warfare amongst the Tash Tepe communities, as the conventional wisdom would hold this to have left some discernible trace on the landscape, we can ask the question of whether the individual centres could have been competing nonetheless, in a sort of prehistoric arms race. Perhaps the most impressive sites gaining preferential access to the trade network, or passing pilgrims and travellers. If not built to intimidate powerful enemies, then to signal at other centres and impress potential recruits or allies. But would the community who built Karahan Tepe have even seen themselves as separate to those at Göbekli Tepe and the other Tash Tepe sites? Should we be thinking of them as separate entities? And what is a state anyway? Archaeologists have been attempting to answer such questions for as long as the discipline has existed. But, like all sciences, the situation becomes more complicated and difficult to pin down into a cohesive model with each passing decade. Back in the 1930s, close to 100 years ago now, groundbreaking prehistorian V. Gordon Childe first coined the term Neolithic Revolution to describe humanity's transition from hunting to farming as our primary form of sustenance. Believing the prime catalyst to have been geography. Since the discovery of Karahan Tepe in the 1990s, this idea has been challenged time and time again, as have pretty much all of the other major theories on the development of agricultural societies. In particular, a good deal of disagreement remains on the precise relationship in hunter-gatherer societies between humanity and the natural world. Which are often by no means as clear-cut as they were once thought to be. Though generally, egalitarianism is thought to have been the norm. In farming societies, on the other hand, a world based on segmentation and separation is usually seen. Such changes in the perception of and potential to appropriate the environment did not happen all at once, but over the span of many generations. Over thousands of years of stopping and starting. But at the sites of the Tash Tepe, where many hunter-gatherer communities ultimately transitioned into farming ones, there is a good argument that people made this transition for the first time. From a mindset typically associated with hunting to one associated with agriculture. Taking on the agricultural mindset without having yet become farmers. Though much still remains shrouded in mystery today, the existence of hunter-gatherer sites like Karahan Tepe has definitively put to bed both the idea of prehistoric humans being simple and that the transition to farming was anything like simple and quick revolution, as Childe had once argued. But with the wild ancestors of both domestic plants and animals being found at Karahan Tepe and the Tash Tepe sites, with others like Chianu and Navali Chori ultimately becoming farming settlements, how did this transition happen? One theory, put forward by anthropologist Brian Hayden, concerns the establishment of a hierarchical system through the power of ideology, spread primarily through communal events such as feasts. With certain individuals and groups over time gaining surpluses of food, which they could then leverage to gain yet more power. Eventually turning it into a hereditary system. With the inhabitants of Karahan Tepe still practicing hunter-gatherer lifestyles, any such surplus was in the future. But a similar concept may have been in play. of people coming together to celebrate and forge ties, to tell stories, dance communally, and bond with their extended familial networks. French anthropologist Alain Testart argues that it is this becoming dependent on the storage of food that leads hunter-forager societies to become ready or pre-adapt for the transition to farming. A great number of wild grains have been found in the Tash Tepe sites, as well as evidence of people working for an overarching goal. The situation becomes even more fascinating when we consider that every enclosure at Göbekli Tepe, and seemingly many at Karahan Tepe, seem to have been buried and covered up after a relatively short lifespan, suggesting that the carvings and enclosures themselves were not necessarily the most important thing, but the act of creation itself. The bonds forged and perhaps authority adhered to through the making of the enclosures, ultimately representing the same spark that made the temples of Mesopotamia, the pyramids, and the Gothic churches of medieval Europe. But of course, to build such a monument would require a good deal of planning, and surely this leadership had some bearing on the ensuing development of society. An initial spark of inspiration leading to an authority being in charge, even for a short while. With these sites in mind, all thought to have been made voluntarily, a question of Stephen Mithen can be considered, of why people would labour in the hot sun when they didn't have to, particularly in a pre-monetary system. They did it for a higher purpose. Given the purported emphasis on spirituality at places like Karahan Tepe, perhaps it was the spiritual leaders, the shamans, who led the group. Reinforcing burgeoning psychological commitments, social identities, and cultural memory. Through the medium of performance, storytelling, and ritual. Even today, the power of a ritual display should not be underestimated, often still including ephemeral, intangible costumes, masks, dancing, and even incantations. Relatively rare events in the year, they can be of such a spectacular nature that they leave lasting imprints on the memories of those who take part, dissolving the ego even, and inspiring a belief in something more than oneself, particularly if never having witnessed one before, or only once or twice. Given the relatively short lifespans of the Tash Tepe enclosures, as well as 100 years of archaeological information from elsewhere, a number of experts have suggested the cave art and even murals of Stone Age houses like at Chat Al Hoyuk to have been largely ephemeral undertakings, not necessarily ever meant to be marvelled at or enjoyed as we do with art today. Plastered over and begun anew at the next point of social transition, in a new ritual. and for the cave painters, never visited again. The act of creation itself being of the utmost importance. At the so-called mega-sites of Europe's Cucutini Tripilia culture of the 4th millennium BC, entire houses would regularly be ritually burned down and begun anew. A concept that seems to have remained in place for the Ainu people of northern Japan until well into the 19th century. There is a lot of speculation here, but unfortunately, given the sheer age of these sites and the sparsity of evidence, speculation is often all we have. Most recently, anthropologists have mused on the effects such so-called hunting scenes at Çatalhöyük and the decorated stonework at sites like Karahan Tepe could have had on ritual performances, and even their commemoration afterwards. The carvings at Karahan Tepe in particular, of a ferocious aspect, largely of natural species that can still be seen in the world today, as well as human depictions and hybrid animals, remain powerful today, let alone when they were first created. Could it be that the very exceptional nature of these images may have contributed to the reproduction of ritual systems designed to access the invisible world of spirits and the ancestors? Only reachable through dramatic physical transformations. With future generations of shamans being inspired to manifest the non-human through their own performances. A circular system of religious ideas, with the ideas themselves coming first, of course. But once they were recorded in stone, there being little way of stopping them, particularly with ambitious new generations ever seeking meaning and a place in the world. For like all the immensely intelligent animals of our species, with the greatest imaginations we know of in the universe, we are prone to politicization, particularly when faced with individuals who have the power to bring the vital forces of the world into being through ritual alone, to bless and empower their followers, to curse their enemies. The possibility remains that the enclosures at Karahan Tepe could have been attempts by shamanic individuals or groups to display in the community and gain or regain the trust of their tribe. Ultimately, to mediate with the divine in such a way, particularly during a crisis, is to constantly have to prove oneself. The power of the shaman could always be taken away again and replaced by a rival if they were not seen to be effective anymore. The enclosures could have provided an esoteric place only usable by them or their disciples, thus cementing their usefulness to the group as the architects of memory. but perhaps only for a single lifetime, or those of their immediate disciples, before another shaman took over and made his own theatre of memory. Perhaps tearing down the old one or covering it up. Today, large-scale or even small events undertaken by religious groups can take months of careful preparation and training, as well as large-scale monetary and resource investments. It seems that something similar may well have happened at Karahan Tepe, requiring a good deal more resources than usual in an egalitarian society, with some kind of shaman or leader seeming to be in charge. Maybe there were many shamans competing simultaneously in a sort of arms race for authority. While this in itself does not necessarily imply a state level of organisation or organised priesthood, it does seem to have been one rung on the way there. After all, communal trance, spirit journeys, and altered states of consciousness are not exclusive to hunter-gatherer societies at all, but have long made up integral parts of complex liturgical religions, either happening in the open or behind closed doors. Esoteric knowledge no longer available for everyone to watch unfold as they did within the circles of old. For the Maya of Mesoamerica, who still practice the religion of their ancestors today, the shaman is still a powerful member of the community. Just as they had been, it seems, during the days of the classic era greatness in the first millennium AD. Then elevated to the heady heights of an organised priesthood. Though arguably practicing largely the same religion as before their people began living in cities in the first place, toward the end of the second millennium BC. And after the collapse of the classic Maya urban centres in the 9th century AD, they went back to living in the forests once more, in much smaller groups, taking their shamanic ways with them. The concept, it seems, like at Karahan Tepe, may well be entirely scalable. Though almost all of the evidence is missing, theorists continue to contemplate just what was going on at that fascinating site in the Tepe Mountains, some 12 or 13,000 years ago. As we have already seen, in 2001, one archaeologist, Jaques Cauvin, incorporating anthropology, archaeology, as well as cognitive psychology, released the groundbreaking book, The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, containing the revolutionary idea that it may have been really the human mind, not any geographical conditions, feasting or material concerns, that primarily allowed people to come together, to build the foundations necessary to engage in the often unpleasant activity of farming. A difficult choice that took a long time to master. A cognitive leap which is difficult to explain in terms of individual benefit. Usually leading to a more labour-intensive life. Heavy investment in seemingly wasteful activities, and the toleration of inequality. Though not referred to directly in the book, Cauvin's argument can be extended to Karahan Tepe. With increased investment in ideological infrastructure, as well as the demographic stresses of larger groups coming together, people could have become more interested in devoting time to more labour-intensive activities if it meant benefiting the group. In this model, a revolution in the mind came first, creating strong stories at the foundation of society, which could then lead to the heavy investment of resources necessary for investment in farming. A cognitive turn utilising elaborate rituals and composite images of animals and humans. The heavy investment of resources in Neolithic societies and the apparently non-utilitarian seeming to continue from the Tash Tepeler all the way to today. Even though its way of life, and perhaps its people too, ultimately died out. Astonishingly, Karahan Tepe may have been one of the first times that this coming together of society happened on a large scale. One experiment on the road to the conceptual as well as economic way of being of later Bronze Age societies. So many thousands of years later. But could the basic idea at the heart of it all have survived? All through history, even to today. Stonehenge. It's perhaps the most iconic stone circle found anywhere in the world. For many, it's the exact image recalled when considering such a term. Those mighty hewn rocks on the Salisbury Plain. Erected for who knows what purpose. Though speculated on for as long as people have done such a thing. For the late archaeologist Aubrey Burle, the world's leading authority on British stone circles, though separated by more than 6,000 years, both Stonehenge and the megaliths of Karahan Tepe should be considered in the same category of megalithic architecture. And yet, amazingly, having been buried in the ground for more than 10 millennia, rather than exposed to the elements, the monuments at Karahan Tepe survive to a much better condition than those at Stonehenge and the other megalithic sites of Britain, where, in truth, it is a miracle that any survived. Given the efforts invested by those seeking to erase or irrevocably alter them over the centuries. Not much evidence survives of artistic embellishments at stone circles in Britain and Ireland. Though, given the sheer amount of rain over the close to 5,000 years of their existence on the landscape, as well as the vast amounts of Puritans over the centuries who have sought to remove the devil's influence, this comes as no surprise. And yet, some carvings and art does survive. Particularly at sites like Newgrange and Knowth in Ireland's Boyne Valley, where myriad swirling patterns have been found, as well as on the insides of megalithic tombs in Brittany. Very different to Karahan Tepe, but there nonetheless. But are these sites really all that similar? After all, Karahan Tepe was created by forager hunters, and Stonehenge pastoralist farmers. And yet, it could be argued that these distinctions become somewhat defunct when faced with the great physicality of their creations in the Tash Tepeler. Distinguishing those affluent hunter-gatherers from their non-megalith building cousins. Much more flexible in social and ideological commitments. Just as the seasonal tendencies and relative freedom of movement of the Stonehenge builders distinguishes them from other much more sedentary, urbanised farming populations, like in the ancient Near East. In both societies, that of Neolithic Britain and the Tash Tepeler in southeastern Turkey, a good deal of seasonal migrations and movement throughout the year seems to have taken place. Given the evidence, it seems probable that the holy sites were not inhabited at all times, but for most people, visited at certain times of the year. Perhaps like Australian Aboriginals, following so-called dream paths and songlines, passed down over the generations to reach the far-off holy centres. Ancestral knowledge passed down in the form of stories, containing deep knowledge of the land and the creatures that dwelled within. Like those visiting Mecca on the Hajj, maybe some would only visit once in a lifetime for a great festival. Others much more often. Yearly perhaps, depending on means or personal persuasion. Smaller stone circles could have been local phenomenons, whereas larger ones like Callanish, the Ring of Brodgar, Avebury and Stonehenge, havens for much larger conglomerations of travellers. All alike, unknowingly perhaps, harking back to the rituals and dramatic performances of shamanic individuals of the Upper Paleolithic. At sites like Karahan Tepe, so many millennia before. Vast performances perhaps being acted out in open-air amphitheatres. Far larger in scale due to the much larger population possible since the adoption of agriculture. But with the older ways of being that enabled that leap in the first place still there. Like the ritual sites of hunter-gatherers, those of the Neolithic are very often associated with extraordinary natural features, like huge trees, impressive rock formations, or lakes. Stone circles almost always have an incredible view, often being placed up high in a prominent location, just like at Karahan Tepe. And perhaps most astonishingly of all, it isn't just Eurasia where places like these can be found. On the other side of the world, in ancient Japan, the Jomon culture, which flourished from more than 15,000 years ago until just a few centuries before the Common Era. One of the most fascinating hunter-gatherer societies on the planet flourished. Also building stone circles, some of the largest and most impressive found anywhere. Even in ancient North America, the astonishing predecessors of the Mississippian mound builders, also living a hunter-gatherer existence, constructed huge monuments in what is now Louisiana, at sites like Poverty Point and Watson Brake. Looking eerily like giant amphitheatres, many thousands of years ago. Watson Brake in particular, dating to the 4th millennium BC. Similarly, in Peru, when the very first urban societies began to coalesce, in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, on the coastal centres of the Norte Chico, such as Corral, sunken circular enclosures are found. Along with evidence of feasting activities having taken place, musical instruments, and the coming together of people to build massive monumental architecture for the first time. There is an argument then for these phenomena having appeared independently all over the world. Like pyramids, the concept being an obvious one, somehow hardwired into how early human groups organised themselves. So then, rather than having roots in the Neolithic, as often generally assumed, all societies on Earth having their roots in the shared cognitive revolution happening all the way back in the Paleolithic as early as 50,000 years ago. Ancestors of all human societies. A line of succession being traceable all the way from Karahan Tepe in the first days of the Holocene, to the stone circle builders of the Neolithic, and on to the Bronze Age with the open-air assembly sites at Minoan centres like Knossos and Cycladic holy sanctuaries like Daskaleo. Just as the massive open-air platform at Aguada Phoenix in Mesoamerica can be seen to trace directly through to the Maya ball courts of a later age. perhaps sport, ritualized or not, played a part at Karahan Tepe and Stonehenge too. As we have seen, the term ritual should not be understood now as some sort of autonomous process separate from the everyday. It having become something of a joke in archaeological circles due to its apparent overuse. We are fundamentally ritualistic animals who place meaning into much of what we do. Even today, ritual is suffused into our everyday lives. Ashes of a loved one placed on a mantelpiece. Morning coffee and a newspaper. Meanings placed on the mundane. Comfort gained from a routine. Rather than being some separate religious concept from everyday life, ritual has always been entangled, often merging with politics and the economy. Individual rituals are one thing, but when entire clans and tribes come together, like at Karahan Tepe or Stonehenge, to engage in a group ritual, is when things really start to happen. Such communal gatherings generating symbolic and social meaning, as well as cognitive changes in individuals, bringing them on board or further reinforcing faith in a shared story or purpose in the world. Though we don't know for sure, it is possible that at Karahan Tepe, time and time again, enclosures were constructed in a great ceremonial work, followed by perhaps years of festival-like activities, with music, art, storytelling, communal dance, chanting, even psychedelic drugs, serving to strengthen, realign, or even dissolve dependencies between people, places, things, or gods. A festival that may be repeated over and over again down the long centuries, still making up a firm part of almost every human society today. Work at Karahan Tepe and the Tash Tepela sites is really only just beginning. The developments made there over the next century will undoubtedly continue to astound, again and again breaking the barriers down of what we know and don't know about our direct ancestral past, who we are, how we came to be, and where we are going. It's going to be an incredible ride. As always, I'm your host, Pete Kelly. You've been watching History Time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell me what you think in the comments. Sign up to my free mailing list for historical adventures to the world's greatest archaeological sites. And I'll see you next time. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Remember to click on the link below to start your 14-day trial and begin your family history research today.